We're looking at this beautiful work by Hokusai. It was made in Japan and it was really important for Western art. Actually, it's great. It has its own emoji, which is pretty cool. But for Western art, it's really important because it was made around the time that Japan was opening up to the rest of the world. Japanese woodblock prints were becoming more popular. There was a lot of demand, so there were more artists making contemporary pictures with unusual compositions. And these artworks made their way to Europe because trade opened up. This is where it's crucial for European art, and it really influenced the Impressionists, etc. And we'll look at that again. But this particular artwork is important because it's the best known of the Japanese works, really. It's one of 36 prints made by Hokusai called 36 Views of Mount Fuji, which we can see in the background. And Mount Fuji is so well represented by Japanese artists at the time. There were lots of myths and legends surrounding it, which is why it's so important to them. What about the man who painted it? So the man who made this was a bit of an eccentric. He actually died at a really old age. He changed his name 60 times and he was super successful in his lifetime, surviving on low-cost sales of many, many prints, thousands remaining. And, you know, so many have been destroyed over the years due to tsunamis, etc. So it shows us how much work he produced. When he was 50, bearing in mind he painted this when he was 70, when he was 50, he got struck by lightning and, you know, he could have died. And if he had have died, he would not have produced this style of work, and he would have been known as a remarkable artist, but he would not have gone on to produce this series on Mount Fuji and this particular work, which put him on the influential artists' map of art history. Commonly known as the wave. The original name is the Great Wave of Kanagawa, and it's been suggested to be a tsunami wave, but actually we think it's more just one of those rogue humongous waves, which has been represented here. So there are three elements in this picture. We have the wave, quite obviously is the biggest element of this composition. We have Mount Fuji in the background, which was important to Hokusai and to many, many people who lived in this area because it had mythical powers. And then we have the three boats with men on it. These three elements comprise the composition or the message that the artist is trying to give to us. It really shows the almighty power of nature and fragility of human life. We don't know how this ends, but it's suggesting that this great wave is just overpowering these three boats. So if we take these three elements, we're going to look at them individually. So the mountain in the back, it's very, very small. So it's a minor feature, but it really puts us on a location. So this is a real place. It's not just a myth made up. The sun is behind us when we're looking at this, and it's actually looking towards Mount Fuji, and the sun is rising. This darker colour behind the mountain is the night falling as sun rises. Also, we can see the snow-capped mountain. The sky is clearing, as it will do in the morning as the sun burns off clouds. Mount Fuji had mythical powers. It was said to sort of have the key to immortality, and we see Hokusai produce picture after picture of Mount Fuji, you know, hoping possibly that he was, you know, going to reach immortality by representing this image so often. He did live to a ripe old age, so it obviously did some good. Then we can look at the wave. It's really beautiful, but it's so simplistic. There are barely any lines, and it's not cartoon-like, but it's very stylized. But it just, you know, resonates with us. It says everything it needs to in so few lines. We have the surf, we have this white plume represented by these sort of claws of whiteness, and the shadow underneath. We have this surge of water, which is indicated by these swirls or these curls of lighter blue. Really clever. And it is just engulfing these boats onto the boats. These are actual fishing boats, and they are coming in from an early morning fish collection, and they would be taking live fish back to the market in Edo and selling them on that day. These men are really tired. They've done a full day's work essentially already in the morning to collect their fish, and they are wanting to get to the market to sell their goods and to collect their money from their day's hard work. They're basically sort of cogs in the wheel of the bigger thing, which is nature, and it just shows the fragility because of course these boats were made of wood. The origins of the wave can actually be seen 30 years before. Hokusai made a lot of representations of the wave, but his style changed so much during his lifetime that this is the one that's really captivated us all. and is sort of what he's known for. And the wave as a subject in Japanese painting has really been a motif. It appeared back as far as, the 1330s. There was this real tradition of subject matter, and here Hokusai blends this tradition of Japanese aesthetic with the fresh eyes of this dawn of international trade and an opening up of visual culture. It's so simplistic in its technical mastery, but that's what makes it brilliant. It's minimalist, and this is thanks to Hokusai's mastery of the woodblock print medium. It actually is akin to a photograph in its composition. It's so dynamic. There's this rhythmic dynamism in the waves and the curls and the swirls and the line. It's a snapshot in time. We don't know what happened before. We don't know what's happening next. It holds our suspense, and that's actually extremely clever and very forward-thinking for traditional Japanese aesthetic that was being broken away from at the time by Hokusai's contemporaries. Hokusai has the ability here to break down the organic forms into simple areas, simple structures. We have the wave over here, we have the clouds and the sky over here, we have the mountain here, and we have the clean lines and forms of the boats. It's really rhythmic, like poetry, and there's really no more lines than is absolutely required, which is where it's pleasing on our eye, and we can read it easily, but so much intrigues us about it. We can read detail into it. I mean, look at this area here where the claws of the foam of the wave, we can see the white dots of additional broken off bits of foam. As this print was made from the same woodblock, the colours would change, or the quality of the image would change over time. In other versions of this print, we can see the big storm clouds, the cumulonimbus clouds that are in the foreground of this picture, which is another detail which he subtly brings in so cleverly. It's a schematic. It's a pattern-like organisation of aesthetics. Another example of this clever schematic is another print in this series of 36 views of Mount Fuji, which is called Mount Fuji in Clear Weather. Hokusai even produced a little book of combs, taking a mundane subject matter and really made it interesting in his use of simple lines, his simple use of form, and the minimalism which we come to know of him. Hokusai also uses minimal colour. He started off this series using only blue. He used new synthetic pigment which was brought over from Europe. Here we can even see the minimal colourways. We can see this blue, vivid and striking, and then we have these subtle greys and pinks in the background. It's very simple but so effective. Let's look at the materials that Hokusai used here. First off, this is a woodblock print. Now, Hokusai mastered woodblock prints. He was known for them, that and painting, and it was the most popular type of art in the shogunate, and it encouraged new subject matters, so there were all sorts of compositions being made at the time. This particular woodblock print would be made from one carved woodblock, and it would have produced possibly 5,000 prints just from that one woodblock. And of course you can imagine that the quality and the detail would be lost progressively as the prints got made and as the woodblock wore down. We have a number of the possibly 5,000 left of this particular work, but many of them have been lost, destroyed in tsunamis, in fires, in earthquakes, in other natural disasters, or just have been lost over time. So we don't necessarily have that many which are one of the first, the 5,000 made, and therefore the ones which would be pristine and crisp. One material that was crucial to Hokusai making this piece was the advent of a synthetic pigment from Europe called Prussian blue. Now this was delivered from Europe via China to Japan, and so Hokusai could use it, but it was a relatively new thing. And for years and years, Japanese artists had been using Egyptian blue. They had lost the knowledge to make this pigment anymore, so it was impossible to really produce prints with such a vivid blue. And this was a real game changer. Hokusai used this blue in the earlier prints of this series of Mount Fuji. We see in this, which is one of his later prints in this series, that he's introduced some colour, light grey behind Mount Fuji to suggest night falling, and there's a light pink in the background to give an atmosphere of the dawning of a new day. These are stylistically important to Hokusai here, and they indicate again the simplicity of his style and the minimalism of his approach. Now, Japan in the 18th century was increasingly isolated. There was much pressure from the rest of the world to open up. One regime was overthrown and the centre was moved to now modern Tokyo with a 16-year-old emperor. So lots of change there. It meant that eventually there was trade with the rest of the world, and this is how the Japanese aesthetic has influenced the rest of the world and Western art. Japanese art sprang out of Chinese art, and this visual culture exchange continued for about 1,000 years. We also know that Hokusai was influenced by the Europeans, and in fact there are some early prints of him in his early life, in his early artistic life, of him trying to apply mathematical perspective to his art, to his paintings and his prints. And we know this would have been possible because European prints were sent by the Dutch to Japan, providing a way for him to learn about this mathematical perspective. Hokusai made this artwork when he was 70, so in his latter years. But if we look at this artwork and compare it to what was happening in Europe at the time, we think of Delacroix, we think of Ingres, and we think of these academic and historic realist painterly style works. This could not be further from that. It's more akin to something that we would see in the turn of the 19th and 20th century in Europe. There was much more bold invention and masterful techniques used, influenced by these European prints. Japanese artists abandoned the traditional subject matters for their woodblock prints in favour of low-life subject matters, probably influenced by these other subject matters that were being brought from Europe. And we see this also here. This work really informed the development of waves and wavy lines in Japanese art and then in European art, and it also influenced composition and design. But how did these ideas get to Europe? For almost 200 years, Japan had been a virtually isolated country, but due to growing pressure from abroad and an overthrow of a regime, the country started to open up, and in 1858, trade links started to develop between itself and Europe. These new compositions in Japanese woodblock prints were met with disapproval by the art establishment. I mean, it's hard to believe that these were used as wrapping for some of the merchandise sent in this new trade agreement between Japan and Europe, but it happened. All of this visual information flooded to Europe. These prints started to eventually end up in Parisian cafes and therefore into the hands of some of these artists in Europe. And these visual ideas started to develop in European art in two main ways: stylistic line and bold composition. Stylistic line is mainly seen in Art Nouveau, where we see the graphic line in the billowing hair, in the stylized lines of water, in the wavy lines of motifs and more. This graphic line is the rhythm and dynamism in Art Nouveau derived from this Japanese style of art. By 1900, this Japanese aesthetic had spread to all of Europe, not just in Paris. Abstract expressionism, for example, in Munch's The Scream, these wavy lines are informed from this Japanese aesthetic. And the bold composition influenced artists too. I mean, here we can see the cropping of this composition is new for Europe. It inspired them to be bolder and more avant-garde with their compositions. Artists such as Degas, Toulouse-Lautrec like this idea of sort of a window into an everyday scene. Who needed compositions where the whole of the object was in view? Why couldn't you chop the body in half? Why couldn't you chop the window in half in a composition? And the Japanese colour point influenced these artists as well. They were much more bold, the colour palettes were more minimal. What did Hokusai's critics think of this piece? Well, he created other versions of this composition earlier in his career with this idea of storm and boats under siege of a wave. And it was really met with great success. So clearly this subject was a winner. I mean, we know that waves was a winner in Japanese art in general. Throughout Hokusai's life, he was very successful as an artist, but his prints that he sold were quite cheap, despite the fact that he was celebrated in his life and died in old age. So he obviously sold a lot of works. He was always on the brink of bankruptcy. After his second wife died, his daughter moved back in and tried to help him out in his studio and just to provide some support. And he still didn't really achieve much better financial status during that time. However, we do have a lot more wealth of collection from not only himself, but his daughter from this period. Hokusai relied on the frequent sales of his books and his cheap prints just to survive. It is no coincidence that he produced tens of thousands of works we still have available to us today to see his legacy.
Hope you liked our video. Like the video, subscribe to our page and spread the word.